Today we are discussing about argumentative writing. The argumentative essay is a genre of writing that requires the student to investigate a topic, collect, generate and evaluate evidence, and establish a position on the topic in a concise manner. Argumentative essay assignments generally call for extensive research and intensive interpretation of literature or previously published material. Argumentative assignments may also require empirical research, where the student collects data through interviews, surveys, observations or experiments. Detailed research allows the student to learn about the topic and to understand different points of views regarding the topic, so that he or she may choose a position and support it with the evidence collected during the research. Regardless of the amount or type of research involved, argumentative essay must establish a clear thesis and follow sound reasoning. In this tutorial, I am going to review the minimal 5-part structure that an essay has to have to qualify as a good argumentative essay, and talk a bit about the strategies for organizing this structure on the page. Now, by minimal I mean that any good argumentative essay is going to have at least these 5 elements or parts. They can have many more parts, but they can't have any fewer, at least that is what I think. An essay will have at least 3 parts: an introduction, a main body and a conclusion. We will talk more about what should go into the introduction and the conclusion later. The main body is obviously going to include the main argument of the essay. This is the argument that offers reasons in support of the main thesis of the essay. In fact, a good argumentative essay is going to contain at least 3 distinct arguments within the main body. For starters, a good argumentative essay is always going to consider an objection to the main argument that was just given, and this objection is itself going to be an argument. The conclusion of this argument, the objection, is that the main argument that was just given is in fact a bad argument, that the main argument fails in some way. It is going to argue that the main argument relies on a false or implausible premise, or that the logic is weak, or that it fails to satisfy some other necessary condition for an argument to be good. Now, why do we need to consider objections? Remember, we are aiming for a good argument. We want our essay to give the most persuasive case possible for the intended audience of the argument. But it is important to remember that the intended audience of the argument is not the people who are already inclined to agree with your thesis. If this was your audience, then you would not need to give an argument in the first place. Since they have already convinced of the conclusion, for an argumentative essay, we have to assume that our audience is the people who are not convinced yet of the main thesis, who are inclined to be skeptical of the conclusion and will be looking for reasons to reject your argument. So, if your essay is going to have any hope of persuading this audience, it is going to have to consider the skeptical point of view. That is why any good argumentative essay is always going to have a section that deals with objections to the main argument. Of course, raising an objection isn't going to help your case unless you can come up with a convincing reply to it. If you can't meet the objection, then it will have the opposite effect. You will be making the case for the opposition. So, a good argumentative essay is also going to have a section where you defend your argument by replying to the objections raised. It is important to remember that the objection is a distinct argument and the reply is another distinct argument. The conclusion of the objection is that your main argument is a bad argument. The conclusion of your reply is that the objection just given is a bad objection. So, the main body of your argumentative essay is actually going to contain at least 3 distinct arguments: a main argument, an objection, and a reply. This is where we get the minimal 5-part structure. The introduction is first part, then you have got at least the 3 arguments in the main body giving us 4 parts, and the conclusion makes 5. You can summarize it by saying that a good argumentative essay is going to have an introduction and a conclusion and a main body where an argument is presented, objections are considered and replies are offered that defend the argument against the objections. Now, here is a very important point about objections. It may be tempting to pick a weak objection, one that is easy to refute, and reply to that, but doing this won't strengthen your argument because it won't satisfy a thoughtful skeptic. What the skeptic wants to know is how you would respond to what they consider the strongest and the best objections. If you can successfully refute what your audience regards as the strongest objection to your position, then you have got the best chance of winning them over. So, a good argumentative essay is always going to look for the strongest possible objections to its main argument, present them accurately and fairly, and then attempt to systematically respond to those objections. Now, here is a question that my students sometimes ask. Let us say you have developed what you think is a pretty good argument, and then you come across an objection to that argument that really stumps you. It really does seem to point out a weakness in your argument, and you honestly do not know how you should respond to it. Now, what do you do? How do you proceed with the essay? Well, if you were only concerned with the appearance of winning the argument, then you might consider using a rhetorical device like misrepresenting the objection in a way that makes it look weaker than actually it is, and then respond to that weaker version. But a thoughtful critic will likely see it as a fallacious, that is false move too, and it may actually weaken your case in the eyes of your intended audience, which is opposite effect of what you intended. I think that if you really are confused by an objection, then you can do one of the two things. One, you can change your mind, you can accept that your argument fails and either give up the thesis or look for a better argument for it. But maybe you are not willing to give up your argument so soon. In the face of a tough objection, there is nothing wrong with saying, "That's a good objection. I will have to think about that." Maybe with a little thought you can come up with a good response, but until then rationality dictates that you should at least suspend judgment about whether your argument is really as good as you thought it was. Maybe it is and you can come up with a good defense, but maybe it is not. What you are admitting when you can't come up with a good reply is that you are not in a position to be confident about that. Now, we have got this three-part structure to the main body with a main argument followed by an objection and then a reply. The question is, should this be the way you actually organize the essay on the page, with a section devoted to the main argument followed by the objection followed by the reply? The answer is yes, you could, but no, you do not have to. The logical structure I have given here is what people will be focusing on when they try to extract the argumentative content from your essay. But just as you can write the same argument in many different ways, you can organize an argumentative essay in many different ways that preserves the same logical structure. How you choose to organize it will depend on a number of different things, like whether your audience is already familiar with the main argument, or whether an objection is going to focus on the truth of a specific premise, or whether it is going to challenge the logic of the main argument taken as a whole, or whether you are going to focus on lots of different objections rather than one big objection, or whether you are going to focus more on replies to the common objections, and so on. And some of it will come down to stylistic choices, how you want to lead the reader through the argument. There is no one set way of doing this. Just to illustrate, here is an example of an alternative organizational structure. You start off presenting your main argument. You lay out premise 1 and premise 2 of your main argument, but you anticipate that premise 2 is going to be contentious for some audiences. So, instead of waiting to address the natural objection, you deal with it right here. You consider the objection to the premise 2 and you respond to the objection right away. Then you move on and finish the argument. Now, your main argument is presented. You have dealt with one objection, but maybe now you want to consider another objection, one that turns on the logic of the argument as a whole. So, you raise that objection and follow up with a reply. This is a perfectly good way of presenting the argument to the reader, even though some of the replies and objections are mixed into the presentation of the main argument. This is also a perfectly good way of organizing the essay into paragraphs. Not every element in the reasoning needs its own paragraph. It all depends on context and how much actually needs to be said to make a particular point. For example, sometimes you can state an objection in a single sentence. Let us say that the objection to the premise 2 above can be phrased as a single sentence. Then it might be very natural to combine the reply and the objection into a single paragraph. There are no set rules for how to do this, and you might find yourself adding and deleting and reorganizing paragraphs as you work through the essay. But However you organize it, the three-part structure of argument, objection and reply needs to be clear. This lecture is designed to help writers develop and use logical arguments in writing. It also is helpful for the writers to analyze the arguments of others and generate their own arguments. However, it is important to remember that logic is only one aspect of a successful argument. Non-logical arguments, statements that cannot be logically proven or disproved, are important in argumentative writing, such as appeals to emotions or values. Illogical arguments, on the other hand, are false and must be avoided. Logic is a formal system of analysis that helps writers invent, demonstrate and prove arguments. It works by testing propositions against one another to determine their accuracy. People often think they are using logic when they avoid emotions or make arguments based on their common sense, such as everyone should look out for their own self interests or people have the right to be free. However, unemotional or common sense statements are not always equivalent to logical statements. To be logical, a proposition must be tested within a logical sequence. The most famous logical sequence, called the syllogism, was developed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. His most famous syllogism is: Premise 1, all men are mortal; Premise 2, Socrates is a man; Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. In this sequence, premise 2 is tested against premise 1 to reach the logical conclusion. Within this system, if both premises are considered valid, there is no other logical conclusion than determining that Socrates is a mortal. Now, we have covered a lot here, so let us summarize everything. An argumentative essay has a minimal 5-part structure. It has an introduction, a conclusion and a main body that itself contains at least 3 distinct arguments. The main argument of the essay is a distinct argument, but you also have to consider the strongest objections that you can think of and offer replies to those objections, and each of these are distinct arguments as well. And finally, the organization of the logical elements of the main body can vary. You can present a whole argument, then proceed to list objections, then consider replies, or you can consider objections and replies on the fly as you work through the main argument. Regardless, your final paragraph structure should reflect the logical structure of these argumentative elements. However, that logical structure is organized. This lecture provides some vocabulary and strategies for determining logical conclusions. Thank you so much for watching.